During the free trade debates of the Mulroney-Reagan era, the left decried the threat it called globalization as the right trumpeted the prosperity free markets would bring. A quarter century later, it's the Republican candidate Donald Trump who champions Brexit and killing the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The battle lines are now thoroughly blurred. To shed some light on what to make of the political spectrum today, in New Haven, Connecticut via Skype, Omar Aziz. He's a law student at Yale University. And here in our studio, Adrian Batra, editor-in-chief at the Toronto Sun, Michael Coren, author, most recently of Epiphany, and Rick Smith, executive director of the Broadbent Institute. And it's good to have all of you folks alongside with us for this, the second program in our 11th season here on the agenda. Let's start this from The Economist. Sheldon, you want to bring this up? This is from earlier in the summer via The Economist. From Warsaw to Washington, the political divide that matters is less and less between left and right, and more between open and closed. Debates between tax-cutting conservatives and free-spending social democrats have not gone away, but issues that cross traditional party lines have grown more potent. Welcome immigrants or keep them out? Open up to foreign trade or protect domestic industries? Embrace cultural change or resist it? Let's get into this. Michael, they onto something here?
Yeah, I think they are. I think the decline of party has been something we've been seeing now for more than a generation. Assumptions about class voting patterns, arrogant, tends to be upper middle class people who assume a certain type of person will vote in a certain type of way. I mean, let's talk about Brexit. I suppose I have most experience of that. This is a colossal misreading by the establishment. I'm not going to call them the Chardonnay sipping establishment, but people in London, whether they were major party leaders or Benedict Cumberbatch or J.K. Rowling or even David Beckham, they all said we had to remain. And a lot of people outside of London, and London is a separate country, London is not Britain, they said, well why?
London is Britain, but it's just a very different part of
London is a separate entity. London is so different. The pulse, the vibe, the pace of London is profoundly different from, and the wealth too, and the assumptions, and the cultural assumptions. A lot of the other towns, irrespective of the ethnicity of the people, by the way, it's illusory to think that it was only white working class people. A lot of people who are brown and black said, we don't want to be told what to think and how to feel any longer. To a degree, yes, globalization has passed us by, but that's not the only issue here. There was something visceral and something emotional. They simply believed that the country they had grown up with was changing radically. And here's an important point to make, because I've heard a lot of people say, well, it was racism. In a way, it may have been, but it wasn't racism against people from the former British Empire or Commonwealth. It was people from Poland and Romania, good, fine people, but were coming into Britain and transforming the nature and the employment force of the country.
Adrian, let me get you to weigh in on this. Left and right is too old, open and closed is where it's at now.
Well, I think left and right still exists. I mean, we have, in our country, we always see the major cities will vote liberal, and then the outside of the major city, urban areas will vote conservative. So we still have these divides. But if we're going on the premise of what Michael was just saying with respect to Brexit, and I agree with pretty much everything he said, this wasn't about necessarily left and right. So the Economist refers it to bridges up, bridges down, and the like. I think pendulums always swing one way or the other, and then we see more and more people around the world on both sides of the political spectrum saying, I don't like what globalization has done. I don't like what these so-called open borders and free market has done. It's taken my job away. It's eroded my income. It's not affording my children an opportunity to have careers. So there is a bit of protectionism with it. We see it on, you mentioned with Donald Trump. You also see it with Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders pulled her so far to the left during the primaries, she had to denounce the Trans-Pacific Partnership. She had to start talking about these trade deals.
Or she'd have had a revolt on her hands.
Absolutely. So regardless of what side of the so-called political spectrum you're on, ultimately, we all want to have our own future, secure our own goodwill moving forward. And I just think that it was completely misread by the so-called elites. And I will joke about them being the Chardonnay sipping ones.
You will, because you run the Sun, so you can do that. Omar, let me get your take on this. From your perch, does it feel like left and right is old and open and closed is a more relevant comparison these days?
Well, I think left and right was somewhat anachronistic the entire time we used it. You know, it's a divide that comes from the French Revolution based on who sat on the left and who sat on the right. Even during the Cold War and World War II, actually, you had members of the left and members of the right who didn't want to intervene in World War II, who wanted to keep the borders closed to Jews. And so there's this strain, I think, of nativism and of conservatism, of populism that runs through both the right and through the left. I would disagree with Michael somewhat and say that I think race was at the heart of Brexit as much as economic populism was. You know, if you look at the areas that voted leave, many of them had been economically depressed for a while. But if you look at, you know, the races and the ethnicities that voted leave, sorry, that voted remain, something like 2/3 of British Asians, excuse me, voted to remain. 70% of British Muslims voted to remain. An overwhelming majority of British Africans, blacks voted to remain. And what we saw afterwards was a surge of hate crimes against minorities. And so I don't think it's really an answer to say that this kind of racism was directed against Poles and not against blacks or against Asians, because racism exists on a continuum. And if you look at what Nigel Farage was saying, the right-wing lunatic who heads the UKIP, if you look at the poster that he unveiled, if you look at the rhetoric that he used, you know, this is someone who defended the term chinky. This is someone who's used the N-word before. I mean, we have to get very serious about the racism in our society and the demagogues who have been exploiting it, whether it's Le Pen or Farage or Trump.
I know you're going to want a chance to get back at him on that, but stand by, because I want to hear from Rick for the first time. I want to hear from Rick. Go ahead, weigh in on this, Rick.
Well, I do think The Economist has kind of missed the mark here a little bit. I mean, I actually see a lot of continuity in what the left is advocating for around the world. You know, the left has always stood for diversity, has always stood for democracy, has been critical of free trade agreements because they're too enabling of corporate rights as opposed to citizen rights. I think what we've seen over the last few years is the conservative coalition coming apart in the United States, in Europe. So we now have three camps politically. We have the left, which you know, I take Michael's point, is unraveled a little bit in terms of regional politics in the UK, for instance. But we now have two competing conservative tendencies. We have the kind of Donald Trump populist right, which I fully agree. You have to say, you know, is making an appeal to racism, is making an appeal to Islamophobia. And then we have the kind of traditional neoconservative right, you know, in favor of tax cuts and fully in favor of free trade agreements, you know, no matter the cost. So I think what we're seeing is really a war for the soul of conservatism around the world, and the left is largely continuing to perform its historical role.
Okay.
The other point I make is I think The Economist is missing an axis on the matrix, which is a generational one. I mean, if you look at that Brexit vote, overwhelmingly, young people voted to remain. In fact, the younger the voter, the greater the percentage of Remain vote. And it was older voters that voted to leave. And I think we see a similar generational schism in the United States.
Go ahead. I know you want to challenge some of what Omer had to say.
Well, with all due respect, it's a little facile. It's not accurate. I voted in Britain. I voted to remain. I was devastated when they voted to leave. I wouldn't call Nigel Farage a right-wing lunatic. I think he's a rather clownish figure, but he's not a right-wing. I've met right-wing lunatics. They used to cover the far right for the New Statesman magazine. Believe me, he's not a far-right lunatic. These attacks that have taken place, if you actually look at the reporting, the institutions that have received the reports are not really reliable. What we do know is that a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, a Polish man was murdered by a mob, a Polish man, another one badly injured. They haven't caught them yet. I'd like to see the ethnic makeup of that mob. They may all be white, but you've got to remember that the underclass in the UK is not exclusively white. It's made up of people of all different races. What happened in Britain, racism, I think xenophobia was an issue. I'm not sure if I'd call it racism, because when we talk about racism, we generally think of color. And I met, and it's actually said, a third of black and brown people voted to leave. I think that's incredibly high, because normally people from minority groups are nervous of that sort of change, understandably. When it comes to the left, this is a good point. The left pretty much has gone on as it was, What you are seeing is the emergence of larger parties, in fact, a move to the left from social democracy to democratic socialism. But on the right, there is absolute schizophrenia. The old far right, racist, anti-Semitic, is moribund. You have a new hard right, which is reaching out to the Jewish community and to the gay community. It's playing Islamophobia. It's trying to appear to be pro-Israel. This absurd view of far right-wing groups, skinheads in Europe waving Israeli flags. I mean, the juxtaposition is bizarre at so many levels. But I do believe that the politics that we've played now for 2 generations no longer applies in the Anglo-Saxon world in particular.
I'm curious as to where you are at the Sun. Because, you know, for those of us who remember when the Sun was born, it was always sort of the little paper that grew. It was always sticking up for the little guy.
Yeah.
Populist in appeal. But,
and we continue to be so.
You continue
Absolutely
to be so. But now that Donald Trump has sort of dropped this enormous stink bomb in the middle of conservative politics, are you at all confused about who you should be supporting these days?
Well, I talk to a lot of my American friends because, you know, we're a small C conservative newspaper. Donald Trump is not a conservative, in my view.
And yet leads the Republican Party.
Exactly. But he was able to take apart and dismantle 16 other conservatives during that primary because of partially because of the rhetoric. No question about that. I'm not going to deny that. Because it plays to certain people's basest fears and concerns about where their country is going. Over 65% of Americans don't like how the direction and the track their country's on right now, and that's partially because they disagree with the Obama years. They didn't like what happened. So they've managed to latch onto this, and Trump has figured it out.
But to hop onto this economist premise here, he's the champion of the closed. Is the Sun a closed champion?
No, of course not, because the Sun has always been very mindful and very cognizant of the fact that in order for us to have a functioning social democracy, people have to pay taxes. People have to do their fair share and play their part in it. And we continue to champion that notion of the little guy. Many of you know the people that would many of the people that you know would support the Broadbent Institute. Well, you know, you say that, but you wrote for the Sun for many years, and you know you can change your view and your perspective on certain things, but the reality is
Adrian,
the soul
I was your
of the
token social democratic columnist. I've always believed in the welfare state. Read my columns.
The so-called you know, soul of the right. If that's the premise upon which the left, you know, wants to point fingers and say, oh, you guys are all falling apart. When the times comes to pay the bills, suddenly the left is saying, well, maybe that all of this, these policies and notions and these big government ideas we had before, maybe aren't quite working. And I think part of that was response to what we saw with Brexit.
So, Omar, let me follow up again on the Trump angle here. Are we at a point in our politics now that because Trump is the champion of the closed, but he also happens to be the head of what was normally classic Republican conservative party, are we at a moment of complete confusion right now?
Yeah, just a quick response to Michael first. Whether you call Nigel Farage a lunatic or a clown to me is a question of semantics. If you look at what he said and what he's done, I think it's quite clear that this is someone who exhibits an enormous amount of racial animus. On Donald Trump, look, there's been an isolationist wing of the Republican Party that goes back to the founding of the Republican Party. If you look at the 1930s, the Charles Lindbergh of the world and the isolationists of the world who wanted America to remain out of World War II, even after the worst massacres were happening and conservatives and Republicans knew what was happening. It was America first. And that's exactly what Trump is portraying here. And I think that, look, the interesting dynamic with Trump for me is that he might not abandon, but he's at least de-emphasized the social conservatism and the values-based conservatism that we saw dominate the Republican Party from Nixon all the way up until George W. Bush. You know, Trump doesn't talk about abortion. He doesn't talk about same-sex marriage. He doesn't talk even on the question of transgendered bathrooms. He's quite progressive when it comes to Ted Cruz and other Republicans. And I think that this might be an emerging trend now with other Republicans and conservatives. And again, on the right, there's been a long history of being very suspicious, I think, of international institutions, right? Being suspicious of the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, international trade deals.
Well, except that, let me jump in on this with Rick here, because I really want to understand this better. For the last half century, the Republican Party has always nominated somebody who saw America's place in the world. I mean, Richard Nixon was in the service. I mean, whether it's Nixon in 1960 or John McCain from, what was it, 8 years ago, Mitt Romney, these are all people who were not suspicious of America's role in the world or the institutions that help govern the world. And yet now the Republican Party is led by a guy who very much thinks that what's the word he loves to use? That it's all rigged.
Yeah.
So how are we to make sense of what's happening?
Well, I think part of what's happening has to be seen as a vindication of the warnings that the left has been giving since the 1990s, since the heyday of deregulation. I mean, if you look at the rise of inequality since the 1990s, I mean, we live in a world today where the top 3 richest individuals have a net worth greater than 10% of all humanity. I mean, we are living with 1920s, 1930s inequality that's relatively recent. It's a recent phenomenon and a product of public policy.
So even the populist Republicans, you say, are now realizing this has got to change.
Yeah. So I think if you look at the traditional criticisms of the left of many, not all, free trade deals where they enshrine, Chapter 11 style corporate rights provisions. If you look at the opening up of massive tax loopholes that disproportionately benefit the rich. You look at things like the Panama Papers that make it clear, how widespread a phenomenon tax evasion is around the world by the wealthy, by corporations. I think even Republicans now, and frankly, even Canadian conservatives, can't deny there's a problem any longer.
Well, I want to find out if Adrian wants to deny that. Do you think that a chunk of what we used to think of as Republican right-wingism is now following the left's lead in sort of decrying so much of what we relied on for the last 50 years to get by?
Well, I think part of it is because they see it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think, Omar used the term that they're suspicious of these large international institutions. I don't think it's suspicion of them. I think it's just they don't recognize that perhaps the long-term value of it. They just see them as big bloated organizations that spend a lot of money, and there's a lot of riches that they spread around the world, and rather than what they're supposed to do, the UN, for example,
and Brexit too.
Brexit
the
too.
EU was a great example.
But I think overall, for conservatives in Canada, for example, they are recognizing that if you ever want to govern again and win an election, and I would say this to all my conservative friends that are hardcore partisans, you have to understand that there is certain language that the left has been using for a very, very long time, very effectively, that they should have adopted, they should have embraced, they should have taken the opportunity to move ahead. I'm talking about the environment, I'm talking about healthcare and education. But those are one aspect of it. Then there's the social conservative side that makes many Canadians uncomfortable, myself included. Though I appreciate and understand that we need them all in the tent, like Ronald Reagan recognized them in the 80s, that you have to have them there in order to win and to govern. But Canadians in general and Americans, they've moved beyond the gay marriage debate. They've moved beyond all of this stuff. What they focus on is the jobs and the economy. The conservatives stick to that sort of notion. It's a good thing, well, and that's where they should keep their eye. But one last point on this whole notion of the left. When Bernie Sanders was speaking and talking about campaign finance reform and making sure that we do close these corporate loopholes, I found, and there's a lot of conservatives that found themselves nodding and saying, absolutely, because the system is so skewed one way that he wasn't wrong on those things.
Let me follow up on the Canadian angle that you wanted to bring in.
I find it fascinating that if I might, more mainstream conservative, that you were more inclined to agree with Bernie Sanders than with Donald Trump.
Well, on that, with
really
respect to finance reform and things like that, he was right.
Their Venn diagrams overlap quite a bit. Yes. They have been. Anyway, let me come to you, Michael, on this issue of where we're at in Canada on this. And it's come up recently because one of the people who's running for the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada, Kelly Leitch, put out something the other day which I guess inquired as to whether or not prospective immigrants to Canada ought to be screened for quote-unquote un-Canadian values. Yeah. And she did get a lot of criticism from people who say, there you go, blowing the dog whistle again. What's your view on all of that?
I'm deeply shocked because this is an intelligent woman, and I don't believe for a moment that she actually embraces this. One of the most humiliating scenes was her and Chris Alexander, one of the more sophisticated people in Canadian politics, claiming that they wanted to be very harsh and hard on people coming to this country. Chris probably has more experience of the Islamic world than most people who've ever served in Canadian politics.
Ambassador to Afghanistan.
Exactly. And she apologized in a tearful apology. Forgive my cynicism. I didn't believe a word, but she cried on camera because she'd already done this, and now she's doing it again.
Well, just remind people, this was the Cultural Barbaric Practices Hotline that she and Chris Alexander did a press conference for in the dying days of the federal election campaign.
It was really dial one for Islamophobia. That's what it was. I mean, if people break the law, they must be prosecuted. It doesn't matter exactly how that law is broken, the police will be involved. It was wrong then, it's wrong now, but she's repeated it. I believe she's desperate. The Conservative candidates, and there are more every day, some we've never even heard of, are trying to carve out their place. No, it was shocking, and it devalues Canadian politics. It debases the argument. But one thing is, it's very important to remember, the US and Canada has more in common with Britain in many ways than with the US. I mean, the gay marriage issue, as Adrian said, it's gone here. It's gone. We don't even need social conservatives in the conservative, or they don't in the conservative tent. In the United States, they do. Trump is a social liberal. He's indifferent to issues of sexuality and choice and so on, but he's playing that card now because in the US, there are certain states, you need those people on your side if you're going to win them. So he's lying. But I would also say this, the Republican Party, it's not a theme, a stream from times past. The Republican Party was very different. I mean, Eisenhower was a man out of sophistication and military experience who was fearful of internationalism. The military-industrial complex. It changed after him. Nixon changed the party, and it changed rapidly under Reagan and then the Bushes to become a more invite people in, more immigration, we can pay people less, the economy will benefit, trickle-down economics. In some ways, it's gone. Look, I believe that Teddy Roosevelt was an extremely gifted man and leader, and in a different league from Donald Trump. But there are similarities in the pounding your chest and look at me and I'll get it all done. So this is not actually revolutionary. Also, it's Pat Buchanan with a different hairstyle. And Pat must be kicking himself because
he was 35 years too early.
Yes, that's exactly. If he had been around now, I think with that shtick, he probably would be doing very well.
Well, Omer, I'd be interested in your take on this from your perch in the United States as to how we're doing it here in Canada. I guess there's some people who would say that we're into sunny ways right now, and we're too nice and we're too modest to have this kind of thing explode on us and have an impact internationally. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting because many of my conservative and Republican friends actually point to Canada as a country that has a viable immigration system with the points and bringing in high-skilled immigrants to Canada, and they want to emulate something like that in the United States. And look, illegal immigration is a big issue here, especially for border states, and there's going to have to be a policy solution to this, that where conservatives, Republicans, and Democrats come together and find a solution. In Canada, I think it's a little bit different because we don't have some of the trends that we've seen. There's no EU that we're connected to. There's no global sort of institution that people think is oppressing us, and that the Liberals have been kind of gotten ahead of many of the trends that we've seen elsewhere and have tried to be more responsive. They want to invest in social infrastructure. They want to give the middle class a tax cut. And the great sin of the Republican Party for the last 20 years was that they were signing all these trade deals, and jobs are moving out of Detroit and out of the manufacturing core of the United States. And the workers, many of whom voted for Republicans, got no assistance at all. So I think many of them are right to be afraid and right to be angry. The way globalization works is that if you want to do a trade deal abroad, if you want to do the Trans-Pacific Partnership, you have to make sure that the people who are left behind at home are invested in by the government. You can't have it both ways. Otherwise, you're going to see the trends of isolationism. Now, whether that trend changes in Canada, whether we see, if the economy collapses or any negative trends emerge, I think we'll see the political dynamic change. But for right now, I'm pretty optimistic about what's happening.
I want to keep it local for a second. Adrian, I want to follow up with you because there's nobody at this literal and metaphorical table who knew the late mayor of Toronto better than you, Rob Ford.
That's right.
You worked for him, and your paper championed his efforts. Was Rob Ford, in your view, maybe almost the first proponent of this new closed as opposed to open style of politics? He was not a big fan of immigration and certainly made points to say, no more immigrants in Toronto until we take care of the people who are already here.
I don't know if it started with Rob. I think there were glimpses of it with Ralph Klein, with the former Premier of Alberta, rest his soul as well. I think what Rob did was he spoke to a lot of immigrants who feel, whether you like it or not, and you feel it makes you feel uncomfortable, there's a sense that I'm in, my family's in, shut the border down. And
Or
if
I came in the legal way.
I came in the legal way.
Yeah.
I didn't jump a
Jump the
queue.
queue.
I did it the proper methodical way. We waited and we went through the whole process. What former Mayor Ford was able to do, I think, was speak plainly, and it's got the Trump quality is there too, no doubt about it. A lot of people make a comparison between Rob Ford and Donald Trump. The difference, of course, is Rob wasn't a complete jerk, and I think that Trump is. But Rob had this ability to connect with people because he actually went and spoke to them face to face. He didn't talk down to them. He didn't think he was better than them. And so he had that notion of, yeah, I can be a populist. I can talk about the suburbs needing to be part of Toronto after amalgamation.
But was he in favor of closed politics?
But he was more focused on, and when he made that comment, Steve, I can tell you, that was the day I knew we were going to win the election, when he made that comment, because we had more phone calls and response into our campaign office that day when he said, let's take care of the 2.7 million people here, than we'd had on any other controversy during that entire election.
More supportive
Just
comments.
very supportive, and it was coming from the taxi drivers. It was coming from the blue-collar workers. It was coming from the union supporters. They were the ones that were saying, you're right, you're onto something. And it made people uncomfortable.
Well, he became mayor for the first time 6 years ago, I guess.
2010.
Now, right? 2010, right. So in some respects, he was at the vanguard of this. He was ahead of everybody else in this regard. And it makes one question, Rick, whether or not the rest of the political world is taking this phenomenon seriously enough. What do you think?
Well, I'm when it comes to this topic, I'm simultaneously optimistic and kind of wary of our traditional Canadian goody two-shoes, it can never happen here type attitude, right? Which one of my colleagues calls maple washing. This notion that things are so different in Canada, we could never see resurgent racism here, and Kelly Leach will never gain ground with her barbaric practices thing, and I just think that's nonsense, and we
it
need
could
to,
happen here.
Absolutely, it can, and we need to be wary. Canadians are subject to the same kinds of economic inequality tensions as Europeans and Americans, and so of course this kind of thing can happen here. What I will say is that, coming back to a point I made earlier, that I think there's a really interesting generational shift happening here. We've done a lot of polling amongst millennials, a lot of polling amongst older Canadians.
You at the Broadbent Institute?
At the Broadbent Institute.
Okay.
And millennials across the board are not only less socially conservative. I mean, gay rights, done deal, abortion rights, not an issue, goes on and on. But also really rooted in a democratic tradition and really concerned about economic inequality in a different way than older Canadians. So ultimately, I was reading an article by James Carville in Vanity Fair this week, where he muses about the right around the world, the conservative movement around the world, committing suicide because it continues to play, like Rob Ford, it continues to play to this older demographic, this white demographic, all the while ignoring younger people, ignoring increasingly diverse communities. And so, ultimately, I'm very optimistic that our politics is changing.
They're appealing to a fading demographic, you're saying.
Yeah.
Therefore,
Donald Trump has built a fence around his potential electorate, and it's probably not enough for him to win.
Well, we've seen every Republican candidate for the last number of years. They campaign so far to one extreme, because as Michael noted, there are certain states where you need those votes. And they'll say one thing in one side of the country and another in another. And we see Hillary Clinton doing the same thing. But since we based this whole premise on Rob Ford, he never would have won that election had it just been old white men voting for him, because there's not enough of them in Toronto. And he had, for all of his personal failings, and there were many, he spoke to a group of people in this city that they felt completely disenfranchised from the so-called already establishment in Toronto.
Remember, you have in Germany, for example, a conservative chancellor who is far more liberal on immigration issues than the social democrat opponent.
Merkel.
Yeah, very much so. And in this country, look, I think it is dead now, but remember, in the West, the social credit movement, which came out of distributism, G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, which had elements of anti-Semitism and semi-fascism, Quebec nationalism, which looked to an ultra-Catholic French tradition. These were very unsavory, and I don't believe they can be resurrected, but our hands aren't completely clean. The isolationist movement in the United States, Lindbergh was mentioned earlier, and others, it could be sinister. At the same time, you did have people who said, we came from there. I mean, some of them were frankly just anti-Semitic, pro-German. Others said, we left Europe because we didn't want to fight another war. But the youth issue, if you speak to young people today, when it comes to moral issues and social issues, they don't even understand what you're talking about anymore.
Because it's just such not on their radar at all.
Look, on the gay issue, they've always grown up with gay people, but they didn't know it. Now, they know it because gay people are out, and they realize, hey, it's just like everyone else. It's a non-issue. When it comes to economics, though, and having a job at the end of university or high school, I don't think that's a closed shop yet. I think there's a lot of discussion to take place. I don't believe that Ford was like Trump at all, actually. I think that...
Boy, they have a lot in common.
I think the results are quite common, but I think in personality and approach, also, Ford may not have been a great councillor, but he did have quite a bit of experience at municipal level. Trump has no political experience at all.
Right, that is true. Omar, let me follow up with you on something that Michael just raised, and that's talking about the issue of the German chancellor, who I guess a year ago was receiving all sorts of plaudits from everywhere in the world for opening up Germany's borders and making it really the poster child for an open society and helping that crisis that had presented itself to the world a year ago. And now, of course, her polling numbers are much lower. There are people saying you open the doors way too wide and Germany is going to pay the price for this for the next century. Is she a cautionary tale of what happens if open becomes too open?
Well, I think it's too early to tell, but look, Angela Merkel did a great humanitarian service when 800,000, 1 million refugees, most of them from Syria, most of them fleeing terrorism, barrel bombing, just the worst kinds of inhumane disasters showed up on her border. Now, the second order question is integrating and assimilating refugees and people from other cultures. This is something that Canada and the United States do better than Europe does. I think, frankly, multiculturalism in Europe has failed, and they're going to have a very serious conversation, both in terms of their security policy. And we know, I lived in France in the banlieues of Paris, and I've seen the the poverty there and the treatment of minorities there and the anger and the resentment there. And they're really going to have to integrate people from different cultures a lot better. The reason why I'm somewhat optimistic is because my generation, what everyone calls millennials, and full disclosure, no one from my generation refers to us as millennials. We're the first global generation, right? We want globalization. We want to be connected to the world. We are on our smartphones probably a little bit too much. We've sort of rejected the social conservatism of the past. And I think, my generation wants to welcome people from different parts of the world. And again, the question is, what is the new social contract among citizens who live, among different classes and different backgrounds? And that's a question that Europe is going to have to answer very seriously. And I think that we're doing a lot better job here.
That's a great question. Why don't we've got just a couple of minutes left here. Rick, you want to weigh in a bit on that? How would you make the argument to the closed camp that open is where it's at?
Well, I think that a lot of the underlying tensions with this, tendency towards closedness are they're not preordained laws of the universe. They're not like gravity. I mean, rising inequality in our country, corporations escaping their tax obligations and therefore impoverishing governments and exacerbating the kinds of tensions Omar is talking about. These were public policy decisions of the 90s and the early 2000s. So we can reverse these things, make sure that younger people get a better start in life, literally with a stroke of a pen, with some different kinds of government decisions, and I hope we get there in the next couple of years.
How would you make the argument that open is better than closed?
Well, I'm not going to blame the corporations for every evil, because they're not, and I think that they are the ones that create jobs and give the opportunity for the millennials to actually move after they finish their education to go into the job market. I would argue that it's been public policy decisions made by extreme left-wing governments, like the current one we have in Ontario, who have wasted billions of dollars that erodes the notion of in my view they have been on some of their public policy.
Not extreme enough for Rick and too extreme for you.
Well, on some of their public policy decisions, they have been very irresponsible and irrational on many files. But that said, the argument to me is very simple. I mean, it gave my family opportunities. It's given my friends all around the world opportunities. We see it every day, and the ability for Canadians to get our product to market, it's an easy argument. Earlier this week, I heard Buzz Hargrove, the former head of the CAW, arguing in favor of Donald Trump wanting to revisit NAFTA. He thinks this was fantastic. So we talk about strange bedfellows, but open to me makes far more sense. It's logical, but if we don't do it in a methodical way, we are going to see these extremes. Pendulums always swing the other way, like we're seeing right now.
Last word to the man who's had an epiphany.
Omar's right about Europe, but Europe is diverse. The French are particularly bad at this. Historically, they never fully accepted French Protestants, Huguenots. They were never fully comfortable with Jews in France, with North Africans. They have, I mean, Omar lived in France. I've spent time there too. They've handled the situation appallingly. I would suggest in large parts of Scandinavia, not perhaps Malmo, but in other parts of Sweden and Denmark, it's worked quite well. I think the Netherlands have worked quite well. And I think Britain, relatively speaking, has done well, particularly with, we mentioned earlier, black and brown Britons. That's a very different scenario from the new generation that are coming from the European Union. So we shouldn't generalize, but we can take some pride, because I don't quite know how or why, but in Canada, we have done actually an extremely good job of it so far.
That's a very nice positive note on which to end this conversation. Let's thank Omar Aziz for being there on the line for us. The Yale University law student in New Haven, Connecticut. Michael Coren, the author and journalist. Epiphany is his latest, if you're interested. Rick Smith from the Broadbent Institute, and Adrian Batra of the Toronto Sun. Good to have you all alongside here at TVO tonight.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.